Hello, and I am very, very sorry not to be with you in person. And unfortunately, circumstances have conspired against me actually even talking completely live. So I will do my best in the rather artificial circumstances of talking to two of my closest colleagues who've got a camera pointing at my snout to look at the last 20 years of the Eden Project. It's Eden XX as we go into the new phase of where we are. And I thought it might be helpful to tell the story, not of my life, that's very self-indulgent, but the story of how I and we have got to where we are now, because I think there are many things that will ring a bell with all of you in the room and maybe signpost some of the things that we ought to be looking out for if Derry is going to build on this really impressive commitment to being a United Nations World Health Organization healthy city, and exploring what we actually mean by that. I guess I've always embraced the idea of doing things I know very little about, on the grounds that when I start working in an area I know very little about, I ask all the stupid questions, which I then discover that people who do know an awful lot about it have never asked. It began, I guess, when I was in the music industry. I spent a lot of time in recording studios, not understanding recording studios, and realizing very early on that there was a sort of madness that takes people over, which is that they become obsessed by equipment. I have to admit, this is predominantly a male thing, but they get obsessed by equipment. So you get all this stuff where people would concentrate on the new synthesizer or the new mixing desk or the new type of tape, or indeed new types of recording when digital came in. And you realize that the more that tech and process became the focus, the less and less people concentrated on, was it a great song or not? Was it moving? Was the performance one that actually, if you were listening to it on your own, would make you misty-eyed? And I noticed throughout the 1980s, when I was in the music industry, a kind of stepping back and being very excited at human cleverness technologically, but really unfocused on why were we recording music in the first place, which of course was to create the soundscape of all our lives. You know, if you were lucky enough and had a hit record or whatever, your record would have been something that would stay in people's memories until the day they died. It would be something that would trigger memories every time the record was heard. It was a real gift to be able to have that. And you noticed that people were drifting away from it. Oh, have you heard the sound on the snare drum? Wow, it's amazing. Have you heard that little crackle? The guitar, did you know the guitar was recorded by putting a microphone in a sand bucket used as a fire defense mechanism? It's really great. Jeff Beck did that way back. And the music got duller and duller, more beautifully recorded. You know, when I started in the music industry, it took 3 weeks to record a long player, an LP, of anything between 8 and 12 tracks. By the time I finished in the music industry, I remember recording next to a band called Def Leppard at Jacob's studio near Farnham. And Def Leppard had spent just 3 weeks, getting the snare drum sound right for the whole album, with Mutt Langer at the desk. And I walked into this room and there were over 30 guitars with one string each, because he didn't like fret rattle. He wanted the purity. And what happened was an LP of such amazing purity that was beautiful to hear, and you felt very little. I'm telling you this long preamble about my music business thing because I learnt so much from the way that you dupe yourself and you move yourself away from the central thing. When I found Heligan in 1990, I knew nothing about plants at all. I knew green side up for plants. But I just knew from my music business background that when I stood in this extraordinary place covered in ivy and brambles with trees at drunken angles because there'd been a hurricane just a few weeks before, I just had this sense of place. It felt like a tune. It felt like a hit record. It felt like this is the sort of place I want to fall in love with. This is the place that I feel romantic. It's here that ideas of mystery, imagination are unleashed. And I just knew I had to do it. I knew nothing about gardens. I knew nothing about restoration. I had very little money with which to do it. But I could feel it. I could see that if I felt that strongly, and I'm not a freak, then there would be millions and millions of people all over the world who feel the same way. And that's something that everybody in the room needs to remember, or everybody at home needs to remember. If you love something and you are not a freak, there will be millions of people who feel the same. The issue is actually just marketing. It's about letting people know what your idea is, or what your song is, or what your book is, or what your general idea is. So we started the restoration of Heligan, breaking all sorts of rules. The National Trust had turned down the opportunity to do it. They said it was not salvageable. And then they got cross with me for trying to restore it in a way that they wouldn't have done it. And then they got crosser with me because the public started to pour in. And the things that they were interested in was the fact that this great garden had been built on plates of time. We were looking at almost the archaeology of emotion, that since the 1780s, this had been a stage on which people had lived their lives. There had been 22 gardeners in that garden, and there had been something like 23 or 24 staff on the home farm and in the big house, entertaining whoever the family who owned the house were wanting to entertain. And while doing this, I started to ask questions which, again, people weren't asking. We were looking at these walled gardens, and at that time, 1991, you won't believe this, there was not one productive garden anywhere in Britain, anywhere open to the public, with the big walled gardens, the glass houses, the forcing frames, and so on. Why was that? Chatsworth, the great Chatsworth, where Repton had been, and Joseph Paxton had been. The palace, the greatest garden for industry ever, had bulldozed all the contents of its walled garden because ordinary people would not be interested in the lives of other ordinary people. They would want to rub shoulders with the blue bloods. Well, I don't know about you, but every time I've ever walked into a garden shed, I found a rush of emotion. I imagined my granddad was in there, and I imagined my relatives going well back were in there. I never felt that when I went round a stately home. I don't know about you. And I thought, I think the public will love this. And we restored those walled gardens. We wanted to tell the whole opera. We wanted to find the original plants, and we found the original plants. And you know why? From my archaeology days, I began my life as an archaeologist. I borrowed a metal detector, and we went round all the flower beds, and we found the zinc plant name labels. And when you wash them off with soft soapy water and you rub olive oil into them, the Indian ink and the olive oil react really strongly, and you can read the names of the plants that were once actually affixed to the walls and up the serried ranks of vegetable beds. So we were able to track down everything that had been there before, so that when you are there today, you're looking at a garden of around the period 1870 with all the original varieties in place and some improved varieties. Because again, the British desire to worship the past as if it was somehow a better place is one of the things that holds us back. The past wasn't a better place. Would you like to come with me and go to a dentist with tools from the middle 1700s? Would you? And most of us in the room, or most of us watching, would have probably been burnt at the stake in the 1600s for the things we now believe. No, the past was never a better place. It was never warmer. It was never kinder. It was never gentler. It's just that every generation believes that somehow the past was better. Cue the National Trust. Cue the romantic notion of the head gardener. The head gardener would not have allowed moss to gather on cold frames, nor yet would he have allowed broken, chipped things to be in use. These were industrial places. These were fantastically organized Victorian pieces of marvelous mathematics. Bear this in mind. April was called the dying month. Why? Because these productive gardens, which looked so formal and so beautiful, and you could have them on the pages of Country Living, these were brilliantly planned places where the vegetables were chosen as to when they would ripen, and the fruits were chosen as to when their fruits would ripen, and they were chosen not always for their best flavour. Sometimes they were chosen for their keeping characteristics, such as an appalling apple that we grow. However, you put it in straw and it can survive until the end of March, maybe the beginning of April. It's a bit dry on the old tongue and the palate, but it was part of that incredibly complicated weft and weave of pre-refrigeration days. It was basically the delicatessen. And at worst, it was survival. I'm saying all this because we've managed to arrive in a place where big agriculture says it will serve us all. And the future is going to a very, very different place. In a post-fossil fuel world, all those crops on which we now depend that have become addicted to the fossil fuel injections of nitrates for extra fertilization, to pesticides, will go. And we'll start to be dependent on creating an agricultural series of systems in which we're looking at a much kinder, much more focused to well-being form of agrarian consolidation. We'll come on to that when we talk about the River Foyle project. But so for me, Heligan taught me about productive gardening, the fact that these things called traditional vegetables were amazing and were only not on popular show because they didn't grow homogeneously or they didn't have quite the yield of some other tasteless baby food vegetable. When I decided to do Eden, I learnt something else really important. I went to see the civil servants, having decided that I wanted to do something big in the cradle of for me it was inspired by Lost Worlds of Arthur Conan Doyle, and I wanted to take the crater of a volcano, in our case a clay mine, and pretend that inside some all-seeing God figure had put into a funnel all the abundance of Earth, so that people could come and see our dependence on the natural things and also feel darned grateful for what we had on this marvelous planet of ours. And at the same time, see how clever human beings could be. That was the kind of driving force for us at the start. But I went to Ebbw because you will recall that that was the scene of the last great garden festival. And it hadn't been the greatest of successes. And I went in 1997, end of 97, October. I went to see the civil servants who'd organised it, and they were so generous. And their generosity was that they admitted all the things that they had not quite got right and they would have done different. And one of the things I will never forget is that they said, our greatest mistake is that we saw our whales. We didn't see the whales that actually existed, by which they meant they arrived with their prejudices to what they were expecting to see, and then they found it, as opposed to finding out what actually was going on in Wales. And what, of course, they had in their mind was a place of big industry, big coal, big steel, and so on. And in truth, those were things of the past, and there had been so much unemployment, and many of the companies that were there then were now 2 men and a dog, or at least 2 people and a dog. And in order to have created the economic benefit required, there would have had to be a tremendous arrangement for collaboration with the local community to let people prepared in time to supply the shops, the uniforms, the retail, all the catering, all that sort of stuff. And they hadn't done it, which meant that almost all the money that went into that garden festival hemorrhaged out of Wales. That taught us an incredible amount about local sourcing when we came to do Eden. And we realized that being commercial is one thing. We wanted to be commercial because we wanted to be independent. We didn't always want to have our hand out waiting for a gift. So we wanted to attract a lot of visitors. We wanted to be famous. We wanted to be beautiful. But we were very focused on how to supply ourselves. So we went to companies before we'd started building saying, we're going to be open. We're going to have a shop. We would like you to supply the shop. And we know that it's really difficult for a company like you to grow in the normal world. And you can't go to a bank to grow if you haven't got any certainty of supply. So we offered long-term contracts to people who were going to supply us so that they could have the confidence to go to a bank saying, we've got a contract to supply this amazing project, and will you lend us the money to grow to be able to do it? So this is as much the same for ice cream as it is for beer, as it is for recycled glass products. And today, under the Eden umbrella, there are an enormous amount of companies that are benefiting from a bit of what you might call joined-up thinking. So much so that today, I mean, we've had, since we opened on St. Patrick's Day 2001, we've had around 22 million visitors. It's around 1 and a bit million visitors a year. and we have contributed around £2.2 billion to the local economy. The reason I'm telling you this is because I'm about to come on talking about Derry and the Foyle project. You never solve any problems just by doing things. Everything is based on a story. The reason I was attracted to go to Derry was I was invited to go and speak at the Green Capital, Capital Culture Festival. And while there, I got sort of hijacked and taken to Boom Hall. The idea being that it looked remarkably like Heligan, and could I do something with it? Blah, blah, blah. But the more I met people, and then I returned, I flew back because I loved the place. I just thought, gosh, Derry's exciting. It's got this extraordinary mix of old, of course, unsettled old, and an awful lot of stories which have got friction in them, but also this sense of something that was rooted going back thousands of years. It had a kind of vigor to it, and an incredible young population too that needed, in my view, probably needed a new story of some kind. And I just felt very strongly that maybe working with the community and working with the universities, we could surface a story which was not world leading in the sense of being like all those idiots who get up on stage and say, this is world class this, it's world class that, we're going to build centres of excellence, you're going to be thinking out of the box, doing the unthinkable, you're going to be joining up all the dots. We've all heard that, haven't we, along with blue sky thinking, ether thinking, leading edge, cutting edge, bleeding edge. These are all the phrases used by people who are completely unconfident of the genius of place and the real potential of where they are. Let me tell you a story. One of the most beautiful rivers in the whole of Europe flows through Derry. How many people know that? How many people know the extraordinary fluid languidity, if that's the right word, as the river goes past Boom Hall, comes out through the Peace Bridge and out. And you suddenly get this idea that Derry is the centre of this agricultural hinterland. It's the capital, isn't it? It's the capital of the Northwest. There are two fine universities that for many years have sat a little uncomfortably in Derry. There's been a sense, I believe, that Derry feels a little aggrieved that it doesn't have its own place to, kick the tires on great ideas. So we thought, as more and more people were drawn to Derry, learning from the experience of Eden, we thought very strongly about, let us spend a long time here, let's do a legacy project, let us do something that is about putting down roots for something that is a destination to which people will come, but more importantly, it is a place that will set a completely new agenda, and that agenda will be health, and the health agenda is a really, really big one. All of you who are watching today know that. But I've been talking to a whole group set up recently around the National Health Service, and I was trying to explain when they were talking about greening the health service. I said, are you aware of how powerful you are? This isn't all just talking about carbon, because that's very ignorant, and it's a whole dialogue that's been spawned by accountants because they can measure carbon. But if you look at the well-being agenda, the agenda for supply, the amount that you could really, really, really alter everything if the health service could become if you like, that engine room for the grounding of lightning, of technology and thoughts, and look at it as if it was the national, genuine health service rather than the national small capitals illness service. I've been fascinated at looking at all the work, for example, like one of your own, Darragh McAnulty, who wrote the guide to the natural world, the young person's diary for the natural world. He says in the first paragraph of his marvellous book last year, this is a 15-year-old writing at the time, when adults talk, they don't talk the truth, and it's a very confused world of body language and not understanding what people mean. The reason I fell in love with the natural world was because every time I went back to the natural world, I had a reset, because the natural world behaves exactly as you think it should. It's a perfect evaluation of why the natural world and being in nature is so crucial to health. But what we want to do in Derry at the Foyle River Project is to bring together the research on the growing of new crops, the impact of play in the outdoor world, the reviewing of what you can do and grow and create along that beautiful river. You'll see the designs online. But also, we're entering a revolution. I hate to say this to you, at exactly the time that everybody's talking about regenerative agriculture and how it's going to be absolutely terrific for biodiversity, biomass growth, the health of the soil, we'll be having much less livestock and we'll be doing mob grazing, as it's called, because that's actually what's really good for the land. And we're going to make our water healthy, blah, blah, blah. At exactly the time that everybody has fallen in love with something that we should have fallen in love with 30 years ago but didn't, across the Atlantic there is a revolution brewing, a revolution of tremendous seriousness and a place. If I mention cell tech to you and I mention clean tech is basically meat with no meat. It's basically vegetarian meat. And a lot of people think, oh, Miracle Meat Burgers, that's really terrific. Oh no, in America right now, last year, clean meat sold £1.7 billion. It is due to treble this year. What country in the world is about to go into the clean meat business in spades? China. Why? Because most of their farmland was on the east of China, got built over. Most of the remaining land is now being put to livestock to feed a burgeoning middle class. They can't afford it. There's going to be a culture now of clean meat. Clean meat will be it. That is a big revolution, a huge revolution. We need to be at the heart of it. We need Derry to be at the heart of it. If you really want to be world class at something, don't blow like a crocodile. Don't be like a child whistling in bed so that you don't have your toes bitten. Let's do this thing. We've got in Queens, we've got in Ulster, great expertise that we can coordinate into creating a real engine room of change. The other thing that I think you need to know about, which an awful lot of people in Britain have just not paid any attention to, is fermentation technology. This is exponentially growing, where you can, effectively, you're harvesting ingredients out of the air, just like trees do, to create proteins and various enzymes and stuff. Are you aware that you can produce dairy enzymes and proteins for 30% of the cost from real dairy? This revolution is coming. If we are not on top of this, we will become a very slow backwater. It is also right at the forefront of health. We're going to see a world where nutrition is going to stop being a kind of fuzzy Merlin-like science. It's actually going to be about understanding our microbiomes. It's going to be about understanding all of the impacts on that our diet has on our well-being in a way that we're only just waking up to. The most successful exhibition at the Eden Project over the last 5 years has been the invisible biome, about the microbiome of microbes inside us. How stupid we must all feel that as little as 30 years ago, we thought the Japanese were quaint for thinking that we had two brains and one of them was in the stomach. Extraordinary, isn't it, that today in Cambridge people are talking about the human stomach and the microbiome as being as important as a second brain, the balancing agent to give us healthy lives. And at a time when the general life expectancy in the Western world has suddenly peaked and is starting to go downhill, it would seem to me to become world experts in understanding our health in nature, understanding the importance of healthy water and what can be produced in that water, understanding the impact of nutrition on our microbiome in terms of a healthy future life. It might be the very thing we ought to be genuinely world-class at, and we ought to build ourselves a centre of excellence and have leading edge, cutting edge, bleeding edge, ether thinking, out of the box thinking, thinking the unthinkable, and recognising that Derry was once a world leader in all sorts of engineering. There is absolutely no reason whatsoever why Derry cannot rise again on a completely new green enlightenment, a green industrial revolution, all based around health. What a wonderful, iconic, symbolic, if you like, meta-cathedral, if we were making that metaphor as far as we could, for the aspiration of Derry. Part of the thing I want to end with is In Cornwall, people thought we couldn't do an Eden project. And an awful lot of people who thought that were people who felt very threatened by the fact that if we could, it would finally break the myth that the land itself was haunted by bad luck. I get the sense in Derry that something marvellous would also break that myth about good fortune not resting and staying here. This needs to be a Derry project run by Irish people, with Eden as a partner, acting as the conductor of possibly the most important orchestra in the world. Imagine we have opened the case in a derelict cottage in which we have found, unbelievably, Beethoven's unknown 10th Symphony, and on it is written, "You may only play me once." Let's make sure that we find that piece and we put the best players in the orchestra pit and we make the most incredible concert in Derry. Thank you for listening to me.